Fortunately, the world is such now that globalization, there's sort of anti-globalization trends. So all countries, whether it be the U.S., China, Vietnam, anywhere, has to make sure that they're not too exposed by selling too many of their products or too many of their services to one single country in case tension erupts or in case a black swan event like COVID happens again. The biggest risk going forward right now from a manufacturing and tariffs is not China. So I believe in open and fair competition between the United States and China when it comes to AI. I think it's amazing that DeepSeek and then Alibaba both were able to create language learning models that were as good, if not better, than OpenAI's ChatGPT. What I'm kind of sad about is in the United States, you've seen a lot of tech bros. They view DeepSeek's release as a Sputnik moment, but instead of saying, let's outcompete the Chinese fairly, let's invest more in R&D, let's have more good minds on it, they're pushing Trump to try to put even more sanctions and even more expert controls on China. You see Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, is saying we need to add even more export controls. Alexander Wang, who's also the founder of a big AI company, has also said we need to slap more sanctions on China. I think the reality is the Trump era, the Biden era, sanctions and tariffs have shot America in the foot. If they hadn't launched such sanctions, China probably wouldn't have focused so much on indigenous innovation. The CPC, it's very clear that Chinese companies are ultra focused on building up an indigenous innovation because they realize that they cannot rely on America or Europe for their technology supplies anymore. So even if a Chinese company wants to buy a chip from ASML or from Intel or NVIDIA, they're going to wonder, well, 4 years from now, are there going to be more sanctions? So instead of buying technology from America, they're going to build it all in-house. And this is really hurting the American technology sector and shooting America in the foot. You see that Intel, once one of the strongest semiconductors companies in the world, they're tottering on the brink of a takeover target. There's discussion that the Taiwanese company TSMC and Broadcom are going to split Intel into two. Now, part of it is because of poor innovation from Intel, but a large part of it is the last 4 or 5 years they've been banned from selling their advanced chips to Chinese clients. So this is just yet another example that containment policies don't work. Now, one of your previous guests, John Mearsheimer, has said he's 100% all in on trying to contain China. I think this is one of the most foolish, stupid policies that America could do. One, as I've shown, Chinese companies have invested so much on innovation themselves that they're now as good, if not better, than the United States. If America can build it, you can be sure that China eventually can too. It's either bigoted or stupid to say that Chinese can't catch up to Americans because China has the money, it has the government support, and it has the STEM intellectual brains to try to catch up. Two, it hurts American companies like Intel, like NVIDIA. NVIDIA has said that now their former client, Huawei, is now one of their biggest competitors. So this was another mistake from the Mearsheimer school of thought of trying to contain China. And then third, more importantly, when you look at the bigger picture, I think a lot of countries in the global south, I like to call them the global majority, they feel that the United States is bullying China. And they're worried that they too could be bullied. The United States went from being the liberators in the world, the good guys, the world from the Nazis. They liberated the world from a form of communism during the Soviet era that was not very productive economically. Now they're really almost like triads or mafia. They're forcing other countries to follow whatever the United States wants. And I think the global majority is angry at what the United States is doing. I'll give an example. Malaysia has invested billions and billions of dollars because they want to be a base or a locus for data centers. But in his last week as president, Biden slapped export bans on high-end semiconductor chips to Malaysia. And so Malaysia's plans over the last 5 years are gone. They might not be able to be a data center powerhouse because they're not able to get the high-end NVIDIA chips anymore because of Biden sanctions. So I think you're starting to see a deterioration of America's prestige, power, and dominance in the world because people view them as bullying China and bullying other countries like Malaysia. And that's why I start to see countries are starting to move closer to China's orbit. I was just in Saudi Arabia, and when you go to Saudi Arabia, they have investments from Huawei, from Alibaba, from BYD, all over the place. When you go into Singapore, BYD has replaced BMW and Toyota as the largest seller of autos in that country. So I think you see that the global south is gravitating towards China because they feel that China is going to emerge as a technology powerhouse, and China is not going to use economic coercion to stop selling high-end Huawei, high-end BYD technology to other countries, which is what the United States is doing. Now, I want to see China do well. I want to see the CPC do well. I'm almost 48 years old. I've lived the majority of my life in China. I would love to see the party and the country do well. But again, I'm also American. I would like to see the United States do well. And I don't think the US is going to do well if they continue to try to contain China, because we're not seen as the good guys anymore. We're seen as the bad guys who are using economic coercion. In many ways, under Biden and partially under Trump, we've become what we criticize China for being: bullying, oppression, economic coercion. So it might surprise a lot of Americans, but Chinese actually prefer Trump to Biden. There was a fear in China that we are entering a great age of ideological struggle. Biden was an ideologue. He felt that liberal democracies were superior to communist countries. And no matter what happened, you wouldn't be able to come to an understanding with Biden where both countries could grow peacefully together. And there was a fear that Harris and Waltz would be the same. Now, Harris was a little bit more of an unknown, but she was Biden's vice president. So there was a fear in China that if Harris and Waltz had won, they would be entering another 4 years, maybe 8 years of an ideological struggle. And that no matter what China did, simply because it was communist, simply because it was an emerging power, that the United States would try to contain it. With Trump, it's quite clear that he's not an ideologue. He's very transactional. He's criticized Panama, Mexico, and Canada, and now he's starting to criticize EU. He's slapping tariffs, slapping criticism, even on America's closest allies. So that actually lowers the tension with China. If Trump adds 10% or adds 60% tariffs, it doesn't seem like he's trying to destroy China. He's just trying to extract what he considers to be the best trade deal for America and probably for himself. With Trump, I think Chinese view that there's an opening. I'll give an example. Trump has said, I don't want Chinese NEV automakers to export from China autos into the United States. I want them to build factories in America, hire American workers, and help grow the economy of the United States. Frankly, that's fair, right? That's what the Chinese did to GM. That's what the Chinese did to Ford. That's what the Chinese did to Volkswagen in the 1990s. They said to foreign automakers, if you want to have access to China's growing, swelling middle class, you need to set up joint ventures and you need to set up factories in China. So I think it's fair if Trump, and frankly, I think it's fair if Europe does the same to the BYDs, the NIOs, and the XPengs of the world and says, if you want access to America and you want access to Europe, you need to invest in factories in these countries. The key is that Trump is offering a pathway to Chinese companies. With Biden, it was 100% tariff on Chinese NEVs, and it was a 100% ban on Chinese NEVs and software. But that's basically a 100% ban because NEVs are basically mobile phones on wheels. You can't separate a Chinese car from their auto software because it's all incorporated together. So Biden basically was banning Chinese NEVs, which is one of China's new productive forces and key pillars for economic growth, from ever selling into the United States. While Trump is saying, build factories in America. That gives a pathway. It's the same thing with TikTok. Biden wanted to ban TikTok completely. Trump is saying maybe if TikTok sells a 50% stake to American investors, we'll give an avenue. I'm actually cautiously optimistic over trade between the US and China under Trump, because at least Trump is giving a pathway to Chinese companies to start to invest and grow internationally without fears of sanctions. That's why in the last 2-3 weeks, especially after Xiaohongshu or Red's emergence, but especially after Trump's election, and even more after the emergence of DeepSeek and the release of DeepSeek, you've seen green shoots of optimism amongst China's 10%, or the movers and shakers, the wealthy people, and they're getting excited about investing. I also think that Trump is pragmatic, and he's going to see that U.S. China trade eventually is good for the American population. If you look at it, inflation is a major problem in the United States right now. Partially, it's because of what I consider to be an irresponsibly loose monetary policy by the Fed in the last 5 years during the COVID era, where we've added almost 18 trillion to the American deficit. Part of it is because of high energy prices from Russia because of the Russia-Ukraine war, but a large part of it is tariffs. You know, it's no surprise major inflation in the United States when there's tariffs on $350 billion worth of Chinese-made goods. I'm hopeful that Trump is going to realize the pragmatism. If you look at it in the United States, the average SUV costs $43,000. The average sedan costs $38,000. BYD, a Chinese NEV maker, just announced that their $9,000 model is going to have full autonomous driving as good, if not better, than Tesla. Wouldn't it be great for the everyday Americans if they could buy a $9,000 car from BYD, and that would help solve the massive inflation problem that's hitting the United States? So I see that there's tension between the US and China. That's what I outlined in my book, The Split. You know, everybody has to get used to geopolitical tension over the next 10, 20 years, but I'm hopeful that under Trump that an accommodation can be made, that a trade deal can be made. I'm not sure it's going to happen in year 1. I'm not sure it's going to happen in year 2 or even in year 3, but Trump has a pathological need to say that he got a trade deal and he beat the Chinese. And I think he's going to say that to the American population, even if it's not really a defeat of China, but it's more of a win-win deal. So Trump wants to bring back to the United States. Now, this is symbolic, but there's also some legitimate reasons for this. One, to create more jobs in the United States. But I actually think this is a red herring, right? The United States economy is strong. You can hear Trump talk about how unemployment is so low. So does he really need the manufacturing to come back to the United States from an employment situation? The answer is no. There's more than enough jobs in the United States right now. Second, I do think that it's needed from a geopolitical strategy. But purely from a geopolitical standpoint, it makes sense for the United States to have more manufacturing of key industries in America or in their allies, just in case tensions between the US and China go bad. You can't have all of your antibiotics, right? 95% of the world's antibiotics come from China. It doesn't make sense that you have all of the antibiotics in the world in a country that is a competitor, that is an adversary. It's not in the United States. Companies like drones. Right now, DJI, a Chinese drone company, dominates the US sector for drones for public safety, which I think is a mistake. There's a great opportunity for an American company to set up drones. You know, my son, Tom Rein, has set up a drone company, and he wants drones for Americans by Americans because it's important that America has drones made in the United States, those antibiotics. So I think that Trump talking about bringing manufacturing back to the United States for employment is mostly a red herring. That's something that talks well to the electorate, but doesn't make a lot of sense. But for some sectors that are more national security key areas, it does make sense to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I don't want a war, and I don't want tension between the US and China. Again, I love both countries. But the reality is you have to plan. Don't exaggerate the risks. Don't fearmonger. But you have to make sure that you can take care of yourself in case the bad case scenarios happen. The biggest risk going forward right now from a manufacturing and tariffs is not China, right? Only about 2.5% of China's GDP is based off of exports to the US. In 2017, about 18% of China's exports went to the US. That's gone down to 14%. So China has smartly de-risked from the US. Again, I don't want to see tension between the two countries, but it didn't make sense that China was beholden to America by exporting too much of their products. So they've now gone off into the global south, which is why I think China is better able to withstand a trade war during Trump's second administration than they were during the first administration. The greater risk right now, frankly, is for Vietnam. So many countries moved from China to Vietnam over the last 7 years that a huge percentage of Vietnam's GDP is actually geared towards exports towards the United States. So if I was advising the president or the party secretary general of Vietnam, I would tell them you need to de-risk from the US. Unfortunately, the world is such now that globalization, there's sort of anti-globalization trends. So all countries, whether it be the US, China, Vietnam, anywhere, has to make sure that they're not too exposed by selling too many of their products or too many of their services to one single country in case tension erupts or in case a black swan event like COVID happens again.
What do you guys think? Do you have anything to add on top of this conversation? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.